What if the stars America once trusted most had a side they never wanted the public to see? For decades, Hollywood built larger-than-life heroes whose smiles, performances, and patriotic images made millions admire them. But behind the cameras were stories of exclusion, prejudice, and decisions that could affect entire careers. Some of these celebrities were praised as symbols of American values while facing deeply troubling accusations about how they treated people of color. Tonight, we are looking beyond the polished image and into the controversial history surrounding 9 legendary names. Some revelations may surprise you, others may completely change the way you remember them. And the final name is one of the biggest icons in American entertainment. John Wayne became one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema, the cowboy hero whose screen persona stood for strength, patriotism, independence, and traditional American values. For millions of viewers, he was more than an actor. He was an icon. But behind that powerful image was a side of Wayne that remains deeply controversial. Unlike some celebrities whose private beliefs were only revealed through rumors or second-hand stories, Wayne expressed some of his most troubling views publicly. In a 1971 interview with Playboy, he made statements defending white supremacy and questioned whether Black Americans had reached a level of responsibility he considered necessary. He also spoke about Native Americans in ways that reflected a deeply prejudiced view of their history and their relationship with American land. These were not comments whispered behind closed doors. They appeared in a major national publication while Wayne was still one of Hollywood's biggest stars. And the controversy did not end with one interview. The transcript also describes Wayne using his influence in Hollywood to oppose opportunities for Black performers. During the production of The Alamo, the story claims he rejected Sidney Poitier for a role and chose a white actor instead. It further portrays Wayne as resistant to working with Black directors and as someone who connected questions of race, patriotism, and political loyalty during the turbulent years of the 1960s and 1970s. What makes Wayne's story especially disturbing is not simply what he said, but what happened afterward. His career continued almost untouched. He remained a box office powerhouse, a celebrated symbol of American masculinity, and one of Hollywood's most profitable stars. His controversial statements did not destroy the image the industry had built around him. Even Johnny Carson reportedly struggled with the contradiction. On television, Wayne represented the kind of heroic American character audiences admired. Away from the cameras, Carson reportedly found his beliefs difficult to reconcile with that image. During Wayne's 1974 appearance on The Tonight Show, the atmosphere reportedly became noticeably uncomfortable as Carson questioned him about his controversial views. That contrast is what makes John Wayne's place on this list so powerful. His story is not simply about a famous actor who held offensive opinions. It is about how easily an entertainment industry can separate a beloved public image from the beliefs of the person behind it. Wayne remained America's cowboy hero long after his most controversial words became public, showing just how powerful celebrity can be when an audience has already decided who its heroes are. Joan Crawford was one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, a woman whose name became synonymous with elegance, ambition, and old Hollywood power. Audiences saw a polished screen legend who had spent decades at the top of the industry. But according to the accounts presented in the transcript, Crawford's behavior away from the cameras revealed a much darker side of Hollywood's racial hierarchy. The transcript describes Crawford as someone who allegedly expected racial separation both on screen and behind the scenes. It claims that a contract from the 1940s contained language stating that she would not appear in scenes where Black performers had equal status roles. If true, this was not simply an uncomfortable personal opinion. It meant that her influence as a major star could directly affect who was allowed to appear beside her and in what role. One example presented involves the 1952 production of Sudden Fear. The transcript claims Crawford objected to a Black actor appearing as an equal guest at a dinner table and pushed for the character to be rewritten as a servant instead. It also describes allegations that she wanted separate dressing arrangements when Black performers were present. The story becomes even more personal through the account of actress Dorothy Dandridge. According to the transcript, Dandridge remembered Crawford refusing to speak to her in the Warner Brothers commissary, despite both women being major stars at the studio during the same period. Years later, Crawford's alleged attitude was reportedly still visible. During her 1970 appearance on The Tonight Show, the transcript claims staff members noticed her discomfort around a black musical guest and that she attempted to avoid backstage interaction. What makes Crawford's story especially disturbing is the timeline. These allegations were not limited to the earliest years of her career. The transcript portrays her racial attitudes as continuing well into the 1970s, long after America's civil rights movement had transformed the legal and cultural landscape. That is the uncomfortable contradiction at the center of Joan Crawford's legacy. On screen, she represented sophistication, determination, and Hollywood glamour. Behind the scenes, the transcript presents allegations of someone who helped preserve the very racial barriers the country was fighting to dismantle. Her story shows how discrimination could survive not only through laws and institutions, but through the everyday decisions of powerful stars. Walt Disney became one of the most influential figures in American entertainment, creating characters, films, and theme parks that shaped childhood for generations. His name became associated with innocence, imagination, family values, and a world where dreams could come true. But according to the transcript, behind that magical image was a history of racial exclusion that reached far beyond one individual decision. The transcript claims that from the founding of Disney Studios in 1923 until 1965, the company employed no black animators, describing this as the result of an intentional hiring policy rather than simple oversight. It also points to the controversies surrounding Song of the South, a film Disney personally approved that was criticized for presenting harmful and romanticized images of slavery. The allegations extended beyond animation. The transcript states that when Disneyland opened, employment practices restricted certain customer-facing positions to white applicants. It describes a system that allegedly shaped the park's public image by keeping black workers largely invisible while presenting Disneyland as America's happiest place. One of the most striking parts of the story involves Floyd Norman, described in the transcript as Disney's first black animator. The account says Norman experienced isolation, racial slurs, and exclusion from creative meetings despite being hired as an animator. Most disturbing is the claim that Walt Disney knew about his treatment but failed to intervene. The transcript also examines Disney's creative legacy, including the Jungle Book and the character King Louie. It argues that the use of musical styles associated with black culture, combined with the character's desire to become human, created racial imagery that audiences could interpret as deeply troubling. What makes Walt Disney's story different from the other names on this list is the scale of his influence. He was not simply an actor appearing in movies. He helped create an entertainment empire that shaped what millions of children considered normal, heroic, and American. And that is why his place on this list is so significant. The transcript argues that discrimination becomes even more powerful when it is built into an institution rather than expressed openly by one person. Disney created a world filled with magic, but according to these allegations, that world also contained invisible barriers determining who could belong inside it. Bing Crosby was one of America's most beloved entertainers, a smooth singer whose warm voice and wholesome image made him seem like the perfect symbol of an earlier, more comfortable America. Millions knew him for White Christmas, his relaxed personality, and the family-friendly image he carried throughout his career. But according to the transcript, behind that image was a deeply troubling attitude toward racial integration. The transcript claims that during the 1940s and 1950s, Crosby resisted performing with integrated musical groups. When Decca Records reportedly suggested integrated recording sessions in 1953, the account says Crosby threatened to leave the label rather than work with mixed-race musicians. The story becomes even more striking with an alleged 1954 incident at NBC. According to the transcript, Crosby walked out of a rehearsal after black backup singers were added to the arrangement without his approval. He allegedly refused to return until the singers were replaced by white performers. The transcript also connects Crosby's behavior to his famous partnership with Bob Hope. According to accounts cited there, Hope later described tensions caused by Crosby's attitudes during their road pictures. Meanwhile, Carson reportedly noticed Crosby becoming uncomfortable whenever conversations about integration and changing racial demographics came up on The Tonight Show. But the allegations did not stop at performers. The transcript claims that Paramount staff documented Crosby demanding separate craft service arrangements when minority crew members were present on his sets. If accurate, that would suggest his views affected not only who performed beside him, but also how people were treated behind the scenes. What makes Crosby's story so striking is the contrast between the image and the allegations. The man America heard singing comforting songs and saw as a trusted family entertainer was, according to the transcript, resisting an entertainment industry that was slowly becoming more integrated. His story demonstrates how a polished public image can hide uncomfortable behavior. Bing Crosby represented warmth, music, and American tradition to millions of people. Yet the transcript argues that behind that comforting voice was an attitude that could create real barriers for black performers and workers trying to advance in Hollywood and the music industry. Dean Martin was the definition of effortless cool. With his smooth voice, relaxed humor, and legendary Rat Pack image, he seemed to represent a changing Hollywood where talent mattered more than race. He performed alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., creating an image of friendship that made audiences believe the old barriers were finally disappearing. But according to the transcript, the reality behind Martin's television career was far more complicated. The Dean Martin Show ran for years during a period when American television was slowly becoming more integrated. Yet the transcript points out that Martin never had a black guest host throughout the show's entire run. Black entertainers could appear as musical guests, but the account claims they were rarely given the same opportunities to participate as equal comedy partners. The example involving Sammy Davis Jr. is particularly striking. Despite being part of the Rat Pack and considered a close friend of Martin, Davis reportedly appeared on the show primarily for musical performances. According to the transcript, he was not treated as an equal participant in the comedy segments where Martin interacted with other guests. The transcript also describes an alleged 1968 NBC meeting in which Martin resisted pressure to include black performers in integrated comedy sketches. According to the account, network executives ultimately backed down rather than risk losing their star. Behind the scenes, the transcript further claims that Martin maintained racial boundaries in Las Vegas, including alleged restrictions around his dressing room and resistance to integrated performances. It portrays Frank Sinatra as someone who sometimes had to intervene to persuade Martin to participate in more integrated shows. What makes this story especially uncomfortable is the contrast between Martin's friendships and his alleged professional behavior. Standing beside Sammy Davis Jr. on stage created an image of racial harmony. But according to the transcript, that friendship did not always translate into equal treatment behind the cameras. Years later, Johnny Carson reportedly broke the industry's long silence about Martin's racial attitudes. The transcript presents Carson as acknowledging that many people in Hollywood knew about Martin's behavior but avoided discussing it publicly. That leaves a troubling question at the heart of Dean Martin's legacy. How could someone appear to represent a new, integrated Hollywood while allegedly maintaining the very barriers that Hollywood was supposed to be leaving behind? Frank Sinatra was one of the biggest stars of his generation, a legendary singer and actor whose influence reached far beyond music. He publicly supported civil rights, performed at integrated venues, participated in major political events, and famously stood beside Sammy Davis Jr. during an era when racial equality was still being fiercely debated. To the public, Sinatra appeared to be a powerful ally. But according to the transcript, his private behavior revealed a troubling contradiction. The transcript describes multiple Tonight Show staff members who allegedly heard Sinatra use racial slurs in private, particularly when he was angry or believed he was surrounded by friends. One incident described in the account allegedly occurred backstage in 1971, when a political discussion became heated and Sinatra reportedly used a racial slur while referring to black protesters. What made this especially complicated for Johnny Carson was that Sinatra's public record looked very different. He had supported civil rights causes, championed Sammy Davis Jr.'s career, and performed at integrated shows when segregation was still common in Las Vegas. According to the transcript, Carson respected Sinatra's public achievements but was disturbed by the contrast between the public figure and the private man. The transcript also claims that members of Count Basie's orchestra remembered Sinatra occasionally using offensive language backstage, even while he publicly supported integration. That contradiction became the central issue surrounding his reputation. Sinatra's story is different from someone who openly rejected civil rights. He appeared to understand the importance of equality and was willing to use his influence to support it publicly. Yet, according to the allegations presented in the transcript, he could still revert to deeply prejudiced language in private. That contradiction is what reportedly troubled Carson most. The transcript says Carson viewed Sinatra as someone who sometimes did the right things for the wrong reasons. His public actions helped challenge segregation, but the alleged private language raised questions about how genuine those beliefs really were. And that is what makes Frank Sinatra such a complicated figure in this story. His legacy cannot easily be placed into one category. He could be a public supporter of racial equality while allegedly using offensive language behind closed doors. The contrast between those two versions of Sinatra reveals one of the most uncomfortable realities of celebrity culture. A person's public actions can sometimes look completely different from the attitudes they reveal when they think nobody is watching. Jimmy Stewart was the kind of actor audiences trusted instantly. He played ordinary Americans, small-town heroes, and characters who seemed to represent honesty, courage, and decency. His image was built around the idea of the good American everyman. But according to the transcript, behind that familiar image was a political record that raised serious questions about his position on racial integration. The transcript claims that in 1957, Stewart signed a petition opposing the integration of Los Angeles public schools. It also describes him as someone who supported politicians who opposed civil rights legislation and hosted fundraising events connected to those causes. The allegations go further. According to the transcript, FBI files released years later showed that Stewart provided information about fellow actors who supported civil rights, labeling some of them as possible communist sympathizers. At a time when political accusations could seriously damage careers, that kind of involvement carried real consequences. The transcript also points to Stewart's reaction to the film Anatomy of a Murder. It claims he initially resisted the project partly because the script included a black judge character, although he eventually accepted the role for other reasons. Another detail presented in the transcript involves James Baldwin, who reportedly experienced a noticeably cold reception from Stewart when the two were introduced at a Hollywood gathering in 1964. The account contrasts Stewart's warmth toward white guests with his alleged behavior toward Baldwin. What makes Stewart's story particularly striking is the contradiction between the characters he played and the political positions attributed to him. On screen, he often represented fairness, justice, and the ordinary American standing up for what was right. Yet the transcript presents evidence suggesting that his real-world political choices sometimes supported systems moving in the opposite direction. Johnny Carson reportedly admired Stewart's movies but struggled to reconcile those beloved performances with Stewart's political beliefs. According to a former producer quoted in the transcript, Carson could not understand how the man who played America's moral conscience could support causes that worked against racial equality. That contradiction is what makes Jimmy Stewart's place on this list so revealing. His story reminds us that the heroes actors create on screen do not always reflect the beliefs of the people who portray them. Sometimes the biggest gap between Hollywood and reality is found in the difference between the character audiences love and the person behind the performance. Charlton Heston was once seen as one of Hollywood's most commanding figures, a star whose performances in epic films made him a symbol of strength, dignity, and American leadership. He was also remembered for marching alongside Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1963 March on Washington, a moment that gave him powerful civil rights credentials. But according to the transcript, his later political evolution created a disturbing contradiction. The march was real, and Heston spoke proudly about his involvement for years. Yet the transcript claims that decades later, his public language had changed dramatically. By the 1990s, Heston was speaking about crime, hip-hop culture, family breakdown, and social disorder in ways that critics viewed as racially coded. The transcript specifically points to a 1997 Playboy interview in which Heston allegedly argued that certain communities needed to address their own culture before demanding equal treatment. It says he placed greater emphasis on the breakdown of the black family than on systemic racism, shifting responsibility away from institutions and toward black Americans themselves. His transformation became even more noticeable through his leadership role with the National Rifle Association. According to the transcript, Heston used phrases such as inner-city criminals and traditional values in ways that civil rights critics interpreted as racial dog whistles. What made this especially difficult for Johnny Carson was the dramatic contrast between the Heston he had known earlier and the public figure he saw later. The transcript describes Carson remembering Heston's passion for civil rights during the 1960s and 1970s, while noticing a very different tone by the 1990s. During a later Tonight Show appearance, the transcript claims Heston's behavior changed when a young black comedian was also booked. The warmth and camaraderie he normally showed other guests were reportedly absent. That contrast raises a difficult question. Was Heston's early civil rights activism genuine, or did his beliefs change over time? The transcript does not offer an easy answer. Instead, it presents his story as an example of how a public figure can move from one political identity to another, leaving behind a legacy that is far more complicated than the heroic image people once remembered. Heston's story is powerful because it is not simply about what he believed at one moment in his life. It is about transformation, contradiction, and how dramatically a person's public image can change across decades. Lucille Ball was one of the most influential women in television history. She broke barriers as a producer, built an extraordinary career, and became beloved as the star of I Love Lucy. Her marriage to Desi Arnaz also challenged television conventions, making their on-screen relationship one of the most groundbreaking partnerships of its time. But according to the transcript, Ball's progressive image had a complicated contradiction when it came to racial representation. The transcript claims that despite her influence, I Love Lucy remained almost entirely white throughout its six-season run. It says that when CBS suggested introducing a black family into the neighborhood, Ball personally rejected the idea and later turned down scripts that included black characters in meaningful roles. The account also claims that Ball declined an opportunity for Ethel Waters, one of the most respected black actresses of the era, to appear as a guest star in 1957. According to the transcript, the reason given was concern about audience comfort. What makes the story more complicated is Ball's relationship with Desi Arnaz. She had fought network executives to keep her Cuban husband as her on-screen partner, challenging attitudes that could have prevented their interracial marriage from being portrayed on television. Yet the transcript argues that the same willingness to challenge one barrier did not translate into broader racial representation. Her influence extended beyond the show itself. The transcript claims that Desilu Studios continued hiring relatively few minority writers and directors despite growing pressure on Hollywood to become more inclusive. That contradiction is at the heart of Lucille Ball's story. She could be progressive in one area while allegedly reinforcing exclusion in another. Her career demonstrated how someone could break important barriers for women and still participate in a system that left other groups largely invisible. And that is what makes her place on this list so surprising. Lucille Ball became a symbol of television progress, but according to the allegations presented in the transcript, her version of progress had limits. Her legacy shows that history is rarely as simple as the heroes we remember, because even groundbreaking figures can carry contradictions that only become visible when we look beyond the image audiences were given.